So, welcome back. The problem of these towers is that we have to go from one place to another via the lift, so thank you for your patience. And now we will kick off with our second roundtable on regional energy transitions. The moderator will be María Mendiluce. She is Managing Director of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. She has over 20 years of experience in energy, and since 2008 she has been leading the application of the strategies to create the Program for Sustainable Development of the World Business Council on a circular economy. She is developing the new strategy for transport in cities. Before joining the World Business Council, she was in different important missions in Barcelona, at the economy office of the government, and right now she's a lecturer at the University of Geneva. And the list of speakers are David Nelson, Ferrán, Tarradellas, and César, Emiliano, Hernández.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the Energy Club for inviting me to participate here. I lived for many years in Madrid previously, and it's a pleasure to see many friends here again. Well, so we have this roundtable on regional energy transitions, and I have the pleasure of having here with me three distinguished speakers. First of all, we have David Nelson here with us. David Nelson is half Spanish, actually. We could say, well, he's a little Spanish, a little Swedish, but he will speak half in English, half in Spanish. And he's the Executive Director of the Energy Finance of the Climate Policy Initiative, which is an initiative that was founded by Soros and by a lecturer from Peter. And Peter, his surname, what was his surname? Heller. Okay, he's a lecturer, very well known in Stanford, international well known. And David has been working in analyzing energy transitions over the world. He has been designing markets, new businesses, new financial instruments, how to deal with costs and the development of renewables.
Muchas gracias, Ferrán.
And then we have here Ferrán Tarradellas. He's the head of the European Commission representation in Barcelona. And he is a journalist, actually, we could say, right? And he's been working as a spokesman for two commissaries in Europe. And I'm sure he'll be able to communicate well, because what's important here is to convey the message. And that's a very important role. And finally, from Mexico, we have César Emiliano Hernández with us, who currently is at the Commission for Competition. But before, he has been working as the Deputy Secretary of Electricity at the Mexican Ministry of Energy. And I'm sure we will see him very soon in the next government, which is a very good thing, because there will be a huge transition of the whole work that has been carried out. I think that what is interesting in his CV is that he has been appointed in the Mexican Renewable Person of the Year. What does this actually mean? Does it mean that you as a person are renewable, or what does it mean? But I think that this speaks really about what you're going to talk to us today. And now, well, when I was listening to the representative of OPEC, I thought that the energy transition is really a field that includes lots of theories and lots of different ways of understanding it. Even when I was talking with the panelists about what they're going to talk, I realized that the approach is different for different people. For me, energy transition is about a global transition. At the entity where I work, where we collaborate with 200 companies, we're looking at how to carry out this transition with different systems so that this would be sustainable. And of course, energy transition is one of the main elements of this plan. But when we talk about climate change, we also have to look at transportation of cities, food, and how results can be delivered, and how environmental issues and risks and all these.
De resultados, ¿no?
Stranded costs have to be taken into account also. For me, energy transition is something holistic, really. It includes also transportation transition, of course, how to use also materials in the industry and how agriculture is developed. But today we're going to talk about has traditionally been named energy and electricity and renewables. There are several factors and trends that are determining really this transformation, this transition. First of all, renewables are a main factor. They are cheaper nowadays than before. And we are seeing currently that these are expanding, their use is expanding, and they are really offering the opportunity to use them for the creation, for the generation of electricity. Digitalization is another important factor. It is really transforming the consumption of energy, both in transportation of people and of goods, and in the use of energies, and it really has a huge impact, which I think is not necessarily reflected in some of the scenarios we have been dealing with today. Then the development of technologies for storage also open new possibilities for the electrification of energy consumption, and then the development of new energy models. If I showed you a slide, because I have one I like a lot, where it says that Apple has become a seller of energy, and Google also has electric parks, ABS is selling mobility, IKEA is selling also energy. The borders between sectors at the level of companies has really become really blurred, because there are lots of business opportunities beyond their traditional business possibilities. And I really like to see how these borders, I'd like to see how these borders are going to be dealt by the governments in the laws, in the legislation, in the policies, taking into account transversal policies. When we talk about transition, about environmental transition, for instance, we need to include infrastructures, dwelling, transportation. It's not only energy that's important. Well, so we've been talking previously about some of these facts, and now my intention is to speak less and you will talk more. And my first question to you, and beginning with David, is what do you think is the energy transition?
Yo sé que has estado en la comisión que ha preparado.
I know that you have been in the commission that has elaborated a very important report regarding this issue, and it would be nice to hear from you. What do you think that energy transition is?
Sort of, although my grandparents might have been Swedish and Spanish, I consider myself Mexican-American. So that makes it even more complicated. But CPI, where I work, we're involved in both the Energy Transitions Commission that you may have heard of, which looks at a global transition. But we also have work that we do in offices and programs in Europe, in Mexico, Brazil, China, India, Indonesia, Nigeria, South Africa, a number of places. And one of the characteristics of the overall energy transition is that it really is local. It's also divided by several different markets. You need to think about electricity. You need to think about hydrocarbons, coal, oil, gas. You need to think about transport in industry. In the Energy Transition Commission, we basically simplified this at a level of that there are 5 transitions, 5 things that need to happen. And the driver behind this is if you want to meet your climate change goals. The 5 drivers are, first of all, if we're looking at the forecasts for GDP growth that OPEC was actually putting forward, the first thing you need to do is to improve energy productivity. That is to achieve those levels of GDP growth with the minimum amount of energy that you have. And that's basically energy efficiency and also dedicating your economy to work in those industries that provide more GDP per unit of energy. The second area is, and the second and the third areas are very closely related. The second area is to decarbonize the electricity system as much as possible. And the third is to electrify as many things as you can as possible. And in electrification, you need to be looking at both the long-distance transport in general, industry, is very important and difficult to electrify, as well as the high heat, the heating, are the three most difficult ones to actually put forward. Beyond those three transitions, there are a few sectors, and I'll highlight cement is actually the most problematic, that are difficult to electrify. Because even steel and chemicals, so the three that you remain that are the most difficult to electrify are chemicals, steel, and cement. But steel, there are processes to completely electrify it with using hydrogen. And actually, I believe with some further technological innovation, we can actually reach a point in not too many years, well, that will be the more economic case. So cement is probably the one that you feel has the biggest problem. And there you need to be thinking about things like carbon capture and sequestration. And finally, the last transition that you have is how do you optimize the remaining fossil fuel budget that you have? And what you want to do is you want to create this, you want to use your fossil fuels to support the rollout of more renewables, to provide the flexibility that provide, for instance, seasonal storage for those times when the wind doesn't blow or the sun isn't shining, to create ramp-up. We'll talk about this in India, to meet the ramp-up requirements of India. The good news from what we've seen there and a lot of the work CPI have done in many places is, by and large, the technology, particularly for decarbonization electricity system, is not only there, but it is actually cheaper than existing solutions. We looked at what would happen if you redesigned the entire electricity system using Germany as a model from scratch, using gas or renewable energy with a combination of flexibility measures. It turns out that by 2030, the all renewable system, and this is without having your hydro, and will be cheaper, it's considerably cheaper, and even today it's cheaper at $40 to $50 a ton of carbon. The other areas are lagging a bit behind, but the good news is that economically we have a path. The bad news is that our markets are designed around fossil fuels, particularly electricity markets, but other markets. We have financial issues. One of the things that came up this morning, but a very generalizable problem that we have, is that if most of the investment is occurring in emerging markets don't have, if you build renewable energy, you've got to finance that in rupees or dinars. Those have much higher interest rates. And even though the interest rate in dollars terms might be very, very similar, what you're paying for is in local terms. And that you have to contrast with markets that are set up to finance oil in dollars. And so you have those issues. But of course, there's a number of institutional issues to go forward. And all of that is pretty much common across all countries.
I will come back afterwards to ask you some questions about hydrogen and CCS. But let's continue with Ferrán, because at the European Union, I have to say, I have an anecdote. Tengo una anécdota que compartir.
I've got an anecdote for you. 2 weeks ago, there was a meeting in San Francisco, the Global Action Summit. And I saw Arias Cañete there talking about everything the EU is doing at that level. And then in the corridor, I bumped into him, and I've talked to him a couple of times before I start talking to him. I said, this is wonderful. Now we really need to get into action. All these ideas are just marvelous, but we really need to walk the talk. We need to see how we can make an impact. And he was a bit angry. He said, I'm doing things all the time. I'm working all the time. I'm really on the action all the time. So he made me think about this movement there's been during the last 10 years of creating these climate heroes, all these people who are working so hard, who talk so well, who communicate so well, who have these huge ambitions, but who are individuals at the end of the day. So my comment was rather, we need to have associations, we need to cooperate. It's not about having one hero, about having one individual. It's not about being leaders. It's about being co-leaders. So they said, could you tell us a little about the plans of the EU and how this will probably affect the transition in Spain? Well, first of all, I would like to thank the Energy Club, CEPSA, also who has welcomed us today, and the World Energy Council. I would like to thank them and the Royal Institute Elcano for inviting me to participate here in this event and to present the EU's position in this field. I think that's very important, also at the global level. Now, actions. You talked about actions. I would like to highlight that before Ares Cañete belonged to this college, there was a general management that was called Climate Action. And we really are very active. We've done lots of things, and we've been doing them for many, many years now. But now, answering your question about energy transition for us, well, what would it be? I would give you a figure. We want to reduce by 80-90% CO2 emissions as compared to 1990 by the year 2050. We are talking about decarbonization of the economy, not only the decarbonization of energy, no, the decarbonization of the economy. And in order to reach this objective, we really have to carry out an energy transition. I understand this energy transition has four main elements. First of all, we should change the model based on fossil fuels on another model based on clean energies that do not emit CO2. Secondly, we should change from a model, a centralized model and distributed by a network, to a decentralized model where generation and consumption is more local. Thirdly, we should have a model that is not based on supply but based on demand. And fourthly, this system based on demand should change from analogical to digital, so that the consumer would not be a passive actor but would be an active element. Not only a consumer of energy, so that he or she would also be a producer of energy, that they would be an actor who would decide when to and how to decide energy, and when to consume, and when to produce energy, and at what price to produce energy, so that consumers would be more present. They would have a word to say. I really think that the point of view of demand is really interesting, because when we saw the outlook, we saw that outlooks are based mainly on business as usual. That is a long-term outlook, taking into account that we're going to continue consuming the same way. But we have seen that technological progression has allowed for a change already. So technologies have already changed our lives and the way we work also. So all of this, of course, has an impact on demand. So great if we talk about this a little further later on. Now, there is a question which I should have posed at the beginning, but I was so happy about kicking off with this panel. Well, that's why I didn't pose it. But there's a question regarding implementation. What do you think what region will reduce during the next 10 years the most the CO2 emissions? So far, EU is doing very well, but maybe Mexico will surprise us. Could you tell us a bit about the energy transition in Mexico? Because in Mexico, also at the international level, Mexico really has a very good reputation regarding fighting climate change, thanks to people like you who, regardless of the change of governments, keep their principles, stick to their principles. So what's going on in Mexico? Well, Mexico has good and bad stories, but during the last years, Mexico has had a very interesting story to convey. I think really we have managed to deploy clean energies through mechanisms that sell at the best price.
En el mundo. Entonces,
So this is one of the success stories that have been carried out in Mexico and that need to be conveyed. And now that I was listening to you, it's true that we have this fight regarding the approval of energy transition laws in Mexico by 2015. And there is a process going on inside the society with these big exporters, the steel exporters, the cement exporters. And, the industry thought that having a generation of electricity, because we were focused on the generation of electricity, they thought that that would affect their competitiveness. And as you know, Mexico, since the 90s, has become an exporter country, very closely linked to North America. So we began a German type of economy in the sense of exporting manufacturers and very closely linked to the value chains of North America, to the automotive industry. And the Mexican industry always thought that the clean generation and electricity as a disadvantage for the competitiveness of Mexico. And this was due to a strange symbiosis between our big oil company, Pemex, and our big electrical national company, the CECME. And they had this symbiotic relationship.
Lo que quedaba.
And what remained from the refineries of petrol in these bunkers of this fuel oil, those remnants were used to create
Una especie de arreglo entre.
To create electricity, and so these were the two big national companies. So there was an equilibrium between the two of them. There was a balance. So what we have been managed to do over the last years by passing this act, we managed to convince the society that we could have clean energies that would be at the same time cheap, and it could really be a good competitive factor. And I think that really broke a tradition in Mexico, the idea that really Mexico was based on petrol. So this story of transition has another very important element, which is energy efficiency. And Mexico right now is in the ranking that has been published this year, it's in place number 12. So it holds the 12th place in this ranking, which really is important for a country like Mexico. So these are the fields where we are doing a very, very good job. We are also experiencing the changes of the electrical sector. There's a project that was carried out at the ministry regarding transition towards a smart grid, electrical grid. We took into account distributing electricity more efficiently and with these resources that are not continuous, which also affect the distribution of electricity. But I think that the story that Mexico can really tell the world with this fourth action is a mechanism that is based on a portfolio of renewables that has managed to produce and to attract a lot of investments and to create some of the lowest prices in the creation of clean energies, which fits very well in the equation of providing cheap energy and clean energies at the same time. The electrical sector really is a spearhead. There are other sectors like transportation that need to evolve in order to be able to carry out the energy transition successfully. But the sector that can really benefit in the short term is precisely electricity, the electrical sector, and I think that that's where the transition is really being carried out successfully. And what is the electrical mix in Mexico right now, more or less? Well, I think that is also another very interesting factor. When we look at the regional transitions, and when we were debating about where China is right now, where North America is, where the EU is, well, the energy mix in Mexico and what was foreseen for the following years, for the following 15 years, was that in 15 years, 40% will come from clean energies and 50% will come from gas in combined cycles, which is not bad at all in terms of economic development and in terms of reducing climate change. And other countries might have more clean energies, but other countries like Europe or places like Europe or countries like China depend more on carbon. So I think that our mix is really good regarding the future, because we will have this possibility of having the ability of satisfying demands at peak times, and besides we have a lot of cheap natural gas in North America, and we also have wind and solar energy. So if you look at our prices, you can see that they really are very competitive at a global level. Thank you very much. So 2 conclusions I can draw. One, that in 2015 you carried out, you passed the Energy Transition Act. Maybe you do not know that in Spain we do not now have a Climate Change Act. We will have one soon. Well, I live abroad, and I think that it is incredible that a country that like Spain, that has developed so much renewables and has been so innovative in the past, that it is so lagging behind regarding other countries, compared to other countries. But I think that the new government is really trying to tackle this concern, this problem, if they have time for it. And the second matter I wanted to bring up is that, after all, I think that you really have important leaders. You've had Calderón, Patricia Espinosa is also leading the convention of the UN, the Framework Convention of the UN, and that has allowed you to advance, to progress, and to face all these battles that every country will have to fight. I know that you're a little bit American, so I would like you to talk about the situation in the US. In the States, we had also there a meeting with Governor Brown, who said that by 2045 they would also decarbonize the energy sector, but he really did not know. The governor really didn't know how to carry it out, but that he would just kick off with this program, and then he would just look at how to really implement that plan. So, may I start with this question? Because I think this question is not really a perfect question, because the question is what country will reduce the most emissions? We should ask what country will reduce the emissions regarding the outlook. In Europe, we already have reduced quite a lot. In Africa and Asia, they have to reduce also because there is economic growth. So I think that the place where there's more potential to reduce over the next 10 years is precisely in the US. That's where there's the largest room for reduction, in the US and North America. Well, but I don't know whether the system will help to achieve that. And I hope that in 10 years' time, we will really have a political change. And, well, I live in California, and California really is quite different from the rest of the US. And it's quite different from other countries, in quotation marks, and from other states within the US. So one issue where we always have to take into account is that energy policies in the US, especially regarding electricity, there are lots of differences between the 50 states. There are more differences between the 50 states than between the 27 or 28 member states of the EU, because every state in the US has the right to create its own policy. And this really has a huge impact. Well, I'm going to speak in English right now. I'm going to change languages. I'm going to talk about Colorado right now because I'm going to change into English because it's easier.
In Colorado, in the United States, 75% of all coal-fired power plants have operating costs, just operating costs, that are higher than what you could get renewable energy for at that place. But it turns out that most of those power plants are in states that still have regulated return regulation, right? So you have your asset base and you get a return on that. The consequence of replacing those power plants, although there's economic value, since clearly it's cheaper to put the all-in cost of wind or solar is cheaper, there should be economic value. But the consequence of that under a regulated regime is that the rates, you have to recover all of the undepreciated asset value in the first year. So electricity rates go through the roof. The companies who depend on this to service their debt basically lose their investment grade rating and almost go bankrupt. Workers are out of jobs. So we have economic value here, but everybody loses. How can that be? And in fact, we have worked to develop a process where you could actually take that regulated asset value and securitize it on markets, and because of some tricks of financing and cost of capital, it actually creates a lot of value. But the problem is, to get that passed, you need to pass securitization legislation in every state. It's not national legislation. It is in Colorado. In Colorado, we're working on it, but it's in Oregon, it's in Idaho, it's in Wyoming, lots of places where just the thought of this creates political difficulties. And so, it's very emblematic that actually there's economic value there, but the politics of it is trumping, I'm sorry to use that word, but is trumping the actual underlying economics. I believe that in my heart that this is passed and we'll get more centrist policies that will enable to do this. But that is going to be the single biggest issue around North American climate change, is if we can actually get back to a place where we can take advantage of all these economic opportunities rather than having the politics itself be so corrosive.
But what you're suggesting is that actually to enable the energy transition, it needs to be done at regional level, at the state level, and not at federal level? Yes,
but the biggest difficulty we have in the States right now is that California has traditionally had an opt-out of a lot of environmental policies. And the Trump administration is now trying to sue California to eliminate that opt-out. And of course, the consequence of that opt-out has been every other state can choose either to follow California or to follow national standards. So if the current administration is able to eliminate the California opt-out, they can actually eliminate the opportunity for the other 25 or 27 states that generally follow California. And so the main, a lot of the true opposition right now, and I say this as a Californian, the true opposition in the U.S. is California. And we shall see in the following months what happens. Clearly in the midterm elections, which are coming up in November, if, as forecasts turn out, the Democrats gain control of the House, I think that a number of these options will change, and we'll be back on a more bumpier path towards a transition. If that doesn't happen in the midterms, then I think we have some real rocky road ahead.
Okay. Well, thank you. I think it's very interesting, but talking about California, which is the most progressive pro-climate, pro-action against climate change, I was astonished by the problems in transportation, okay, which is a huge, it's 20% of emissions. And whether it's in California, in Europe, in Madrid, in Mexico, this is just like no one is, well, I don't know if we're doing much about it. We're trying to do something at WBCSD, but I find that it has always been kind of forgotten, and so it doesn't surprise me some of the numbers I see in oil because yeah, that has been the trend, no? And that's why we have 82% of oil, because it's all going to transport, right? So I think with renewable energies that are cheaper, no, with electric vehicle technologies that are advancing, I mean, there is some hope, no? But I would love to hear your views. Maybe we start with Mexico, because I know in Mexico you've done quite impressive work in terms of public transport. And then I would love to hear from Europe and then come back to maybe the global or U.S. perspective. So.
Sure. Do we do it in English?
Sí, pues pasa al español.
Muy bien, como sea loco.
So, I think that transportation is the second big challenge in Mexico, and there are lots of opportunities there for improvement. The city of Mexico, as you know, is in lots of its metropolitan areas, in Tijuana, Puebla, Querétaro. Well, the traffic is really intense, and somehow I think that the solutions of public transportation have not been good solutions. They really have not. That has not been a success story. And Mexico, to some point, is an extension of the U.S. culture. People love their cars. It's not only a status symbol, but it's also a very convenient way to move from one place to another. And therefore, public transportation really is not generating profit at all. It really is generating losses, and it is not a good solution for middle-class people, because these are, people, the middle class do not really like the public transportation in Mexico. And, well, this links to one of the questions from the beginning. For all energy efficiency schemes to work, what we need is structures and regulations and economic systems that would contribute to the creation, and also some basic political and economical problems have to be solved. Public transportation does not only need a technological change, but it also has to grow a lot as compared to private cars. And the biggest challenges right now lie in fields such as the price of public transportation, how public aids could be channeled, and right now these measures are not really supporting energy transition. The new government that will take place in December in Mexico, fortunately, is a government that is willing. Most of the ministers are older people, but in the transportation sector there are some very young ministers in the transportation field, and these young ministers really are offering interesting alternatives. For instance, the mayor of the city of Mexico, she is a person who also, she's a researcher, she's been working for a long time at the engineering institute, and they have carried out lots of traffic models. So I think that we will really see new innovative policies in the transportation field. But there are big issues that have not yet been solved and really need to be solved for this to be successful. In Europe, we're talking more about EVs, right? Well, as far as we're talking about private transportation, yes. When I talked about rethinking transportation really is to move people or things from one place to another place. It's when I come to Madrid, I move around with electrical motorcycles or cars, which you can just leave anywhere, and you can forget about them. You don't have to pay transportation taxes, you don't have to pay insurances, and that's what mobility is about, convenience. And this also applies for the transportation of goods. If I have a company, what I need is that my container goes from my company to my customer. So how can I carry that out? Well, I would choose the cleanest transportation. So we really should rethink the logistics chain and try to find the best possible means of transportation at every step. And in our country, most of the goods are transported by road, so there is a truck for every container, when with one single train you could transport lots of containers. So I think that we really need to rethink what transportation policies should be. We should look at the transportation means that are the cleanest, that pollute the less, and that are the most efficient in the logistics, so that we would use the roads as less as possible, because that still depends very much, relies a lot on oil, and we are trying to opt for electrical vehicles, not only for the transportation of people, but also for the transportation of goods. And then we should also find alternatives for fuels, for other means of transportation, maybe air transportation, airplanes. The aviation sector is the most challenging one regarding new kinds of fuels. For instance, in Sweden they are using small electric airplanes. That could be one alternative. And then regarding sea transportation, the use of natural gas instead of diesel could also be a good step forward, and the next step would be using electrical accumulators and more efficient ones. Nevertheless, I would like to talk about another sector we have not mentioned yet, which is nevertheless very important in the energy transition, and it's buildings. Some time ago we just could go up to one of the top floors of this building and find a beautiful view over Madrid. I would like to see this view when there's low pressure on Madrid, and all the cars on the streets and all the houses are emitting gases from the heating. I remember when I saw this huge cloud of pollution over Madrid. It was so huge and so worrying that really drastic measures needed to be taken. Now, if we had neutral buildings regarding energy consumption, and if they really were so efficient energetically that they would not need to consume energy, and if on top of that transportation was public, or if people moved from one place to another with EVs or electrical motorcycles, in that case the fog, the pollution above Madrid would just pass to history. So one of the fields that we really need to improve, and I'm happy that in Mexico you are opting for that, is energy efficiency. And energy efficiency needs to be taken into account in buildings also. And that's where Europe thinks we have our main priority. It's not only the generation system, but it's mainly reducing demand and using more efficiently the energy that we have around. And that's not only for environmental reasons, but also for economic reasons. We have very few local energy resources. We highly depend on oil and gas and other fuels that come from abroad. And we are more vulnerable than any other part of the world to the price changes. At the same time, investing in energy efficiency means creating an energy sector which is financed with the savings. So from the economic point of view, it really is an ideal solution that we are not taking advantage of sufficiently. In Spain, there is a construction sector that really suffered during the crisis in 2008 and which is recovering with some new buildings, some new constructions, but the potential there is huge. The potential to create jobs and economic growth in the field of energy efficiency. With smart finances, we could really fund the costs with the savings, with the energy savings. We would improve the life quality of our citizens. We would reduce energy poverty. Reducing energy poverty does not mean giving money for people so that they consume energy. No, it means giving them the means for them to have the required comfort from the point of view of energy, which doesn't really need consuming more necessarily, but the answer is to consume less. And there, the EU has fixed a very ambitious target objective. We carried out an ambitious impact study, and we thought that our improvement by 2030 should have been of 27%, and suddenly we have realized that we can reach an improvement of 32%. When I was the spokesman, we fixed our targets for 2020, which was a 20% of reduction of CO2 as compared to 1990, 20% of renewables in the final energy consumption, 20% in the improvement of energy efficiency as compared to business as usual. This famous 2020, as you know, for the year 2020, or by the year 2020. Now we've got targets for 2030, and they look very ugly. First of all, 40% of reduction of CO2 emissions, and although our climate hero Arias Cañete is saying that we can go even beyond that, then regarding renewables, we had chosen 27%, but we have seen that with the fall of costs of renewables, we can go even beyond that target, and we've gone up to 32. And regarding energy efficiency, which was rated at 27, we have raised it to 32.5%. Therefore, if by 2020 it was 20-20-20, by 2020, by 2030 it will be 40, 32.5 and 30. Well, the more ambitious the better, because by 2050 the objective is to have a 90% of reduction in CO2 emissions, which means that our energy efficiency has to be a lot better, and we have to have clean energy sources. Now I'm going to change to another subject, but before that I would like to point out that even in the transportation of goods we have carried out a study at our institute, and if you do three things, which is optimize the use of your fleet, of your truck fleet, secondly, share the routes with other companies with whom you can share the fleet, and thirdly, increase the distribution hours instead of 2 hours, 5 hours. In that case, emissions can be reduced by 50% and costs could be reduced by 30%. We carried out with this study with 5 companies, and a pilot test has been set up because this really is offering us a huge business opportunity. But interestingly enough, you've got in the strategy objectives for renewables, for emissions and for buildings, but nothing for transportation. Or do you have something for transportation? Yes, we do have something for transportation when regarding these objectives for CO2 emission objectives. One main field was transportation. And there is the emissions market, which has to be taken into account also. I haven't talked about how well our markets are working also. If we've got markets that work well, not only the electrical and the gas market, but also the market of the emission rights, we can achieve our goals better. In the case of transportations, we're trying to fix some CO2 emissions reductions, for instance, through the directive on fuels, and we have fixed the CO2 emissions from cars to a certain level. Then there are some car manufacturers who put all kinds of devices in their cars in order to trick, as you've heard probably. And then the electrification of trains, introducing aviation transports in the system of emissions rights. So there are specific objectives for the transportation sector also, but it's more difficult to have clear targets there than in the case of energy efficiency or renewables or clean energies. Maybe that's like the case of all these cities that are taking the lead in this respect, right? Yes, but there we really have to apply subsidiarity. We really need to take into account European objectives, but who really knows how to combat emissions in Madrid is the mayor of Madrid or the autonomous community of Madrid, rather than my colleagues at the general direction in Brussels, at the DG Brussels. So, David, you said in the beginning that these industrial uses of electricity, well, there hydrogen has a very important role to play, right? In some of the sectors, like in steel, for instance, in some other sectors. But cement was a bigger challenge in this regard, and there the solutions would be CAC. As far as I've understood, green hydrogen occupies a small percentage, right? Hydrogen is produced here with fossil fuels in Spain, and therefore the carbon capture storage of carbon is really key if we really want to be able to use hydrogen, because many companies are interested in hydrogen. I would like to know what you think about this.
Hydrogen is one of several options. In steel, in particular, hydrogen for direct reduction of iron, replacing the use of coking coal, is by far the best option. The one question you have is how you produce the hydrogen, as you said. And, the long-term view is to produce it with renewable energy through electrolysis. But the problem here is that hydrogen is really capitally intensive. There's a lot of commentators out there that will say, oh, we can produce hydrogen when there is excess electricity. Well, if you're running an electrolyzer 10% of the year, the costs will be not 10 times higher, but might be 4 or 5 times higher than if you're running it at 80%. And so you really need baseload sources of electricity, of low-carbon electricity, to be able to make hydrogen work. And that's why it's only part of the solution. When you actually get to the cement, there are a lot of other solutions. One is that you can actually, by the way, on the steel, the first solution, of course, is to reduce steel use and to recycle steel. And one of the most difficult things about recycling steel is that if you take steel and you try to reuse it, it might have vanadium or copper or all sorts of alloys in there that mean that the next steel that you've got is of much, much poorer quality. So in order to actually increase recycling to the point where we can, the average recycling of steel reduces the value of that steel and the energy content by somewhere between 60 and 70%. What you need to do is actually track all of the alloys that are in there. So it's a very, very complicated process. There's something very similar in cement. The first thing you actually have to do is look at, are there replacement materials? Are there different ways of designing buildings and such that all will feed into that equation? And then you may have to use CCS on the remaining bit. So this is what makes that whole last bit, the industry, so hard, is that there isn't, like there is potentially in vehicles. For smaller vehicles, you have electrification. As you get into road transport, you have biofuels. You may have hydrogen there, but those solutions are much more obvious. And I think that's the issue you get. It gets much more complicated when you're going beyond just decarbonization of power. And the final thing that I put forward is all of this ties back to how do you create flexibility in the electricity system to take more variable renewable energy in particular. There we need to be thinking about some of the issues about the prosumer, about the digital economy. There is a tremendous amount of opportunity in demand-side management. Batteries actually play a role, but less of a role than you might think if you get the markets right. But you also need significant amount of policy. One of the things that we have found that the cheapest way of addressing seasonal flexibility, that is, in India, for instance, you have monsoon seasons and the wind basically blows 4 or 5 months of the year. How do you make it for those months that don't have wind or solar? Well, it turns out the cheapest way by far is actually to overbuild your steel mills and run them 9 to 10 months of the year. But now what you need is a market system that actually pays them for shutting down 3 to 4 months of the year to be. So there's a lot of market issues that need to be put in on top of here as well. And so only with appropriate markets and signals that allow us to choose between all these options are we really ever going to get there.
Thank you, David. And we're going to turn now to the questions, a las preguntas que tenemos de la audiencia. A ver.
Questions from the audience. Luis is interested in knowing what the future of nuclear energies is in Europe. And he says he would like to know what plans there are there for carbon and when talking about energy transition, he talks about ideological and practical transition. So, Ferrán, what would be the future of nuclear energy? Well, regarding carbon, regarding coal, it's absolutely clear. Coal being competitive and paying the price of CO2 emissions. Well, I think that the carbon capture and storage system really needs to be looked at carefully and decide where it makes sense, in what countries it makes sense and where it does not. We have not much coal in Europe. It's expensive. It's difficult to extract. So I really think we should opt for clean energies and renewable energies, clearly. But somewhere maybe we have to take into account also the security of supply, of energy supply. So if there is coal there, we have to look at how to create clean coal, so to speak. Now, regarding the future of nuclear energy, I don't know if you know our legislation in the EU. The Commission does not have competencies in the energy mix of every member state, and every member state has to decide for themselves regarding this energy mix. But the EU really has a say in several aspects. One is a subject that is of general interest, which is nuclear security, nuclear safety. So there's a EU legislation regarding that. So those EU countries that decide to have nuclear plants should meet the highest possible standards, and they really need to meet EU legislation requirements. Another very important factor for us is that those states that decide to abandon nuclear energy, for instance, Germany is maybe our best example, they are starting to use energy sources that do not emit CO2. That's very important, but that's not something evident. So these are two factors regarding nuclear energy that should be taken into account. And then Another issue that I'm very interested in, although I know it is something regarding the long term, and well, we really have to think about the following generations, about our children, our grandchildren. There will be 9 billion inhabitants in the world. The demand of electricity will be increasingly high, and beyond renewables, which of course is the future, and regarding also the other energy resources, we also have to look at other possible energy resources to meet the future demands, and we should start investing already right now in nuclear fusion or solar energy on the Earth. I know this is a very controversial subject, but right now Europe is leading the second largest research program in the world, the thermonuclear experimental reactor, which is being built in southern France. And I think that when we talk about energy transition, fusion is one of the most important elements. We're talking now about 2050, and renewables have only a limited capacity, and we are talking now about a CO2 clean energy, a very safe way of creating energy, and so it really has lots of advantages. The problems right now are costs, materials, and competitiveness of this energy source. But we really start talking about this energy source, solar energy on the Earth, or fusion energy, as I said before. Thank you very much, David. We have one problem for you.
Around the world, are they different in different regions? Suppose. Y ya de paso, la siguiente, under your point of view, how should an efficient electricity market be designed in order to facilitate the energy transition? Bueno, quizás esta, yo creo que haces una clase doctoral con A, B, B, porque creo que no te da tiempo a responder a la segunda, pero la primera a lo mejor pues...
You won't have time to answer the second, but I think you can answer the first. Let's try.
The issue, and I'm going to be a bit tangential here, but from my perspective, the biggest issue. Hello, is this one working now? Hello. From my perspective, the biggest issue that is slowing down the institutional changes that we need is actually risk. And this can be risk at the project level, at the national level, but it's really the concentration of risk in companies and countries that actually makes it very difficult for decision making. If you were to find ways, and interestingly enough, this risk is actually climate risk in general is becoming one of the world's largest problems. We work with insurance companies, reinsurers, who tell us that they would like to issue more enterprise risk management insurance, but that they find that there is so much climate risk embedded across all of their potential customers that it is limiting their capacity to actually issue more insurance because of climate risk.
Can you define climate risk?
Well, and here's the interesting thing, is that the insurance companies talk about climate risk, which is hurricanes and droughts and such. I have to push them very hard to think about incremental climate risk, because insurance policies tend to all run on a one-year basis. And what we really need to be doing here is putting together market signals so that somebody who's putting a new asset in place can say, well, yes, insurance is going to cost X today, but it's going to cost 10X in 10 years' time, both because the risk of a hurricane or a drought is going to go up, but also because the capacity that's available from insurance companies is going to fall. So the thing that we are working on right now at CPI that I'm actually most proud of, we're developing something called a climate derivative. And what this actually does is we have models that look at what is the risk to every fossil fuel asset, actually an infrastructure asset in the world. What would it look like under a variety of 2-degree C scenarios versus business as usual? We can take those models and say, well, what would be the implication of a 2-degree scenario on the valuation of every publicly traded company? We can then issue a new product that say this would be what the weighting of a global index, of a stock market index, would be in a 2-degree world. So you might see that that, the example I like to give is you've got one company that's 50% oil, 50% gas, and the other company is 100% oil. Our forecasts show that oil prices under 2 degrees C fall dramatically, but gas prices don't hit as much. And so what you would see is the 100% oil company fall relative to the oil and gas mix company. So if you get a market that shows that, and our transition should be favoring gas over oil in that case, well, if the policy came through, you would see that in the stock price, and this derivative would reflect that, right? And so what we're looking for doing here is to actually use insurance markets. And of course, you have the physical risk, which is as this damage increases on a year-by-year basis, and the transition risk, which is what we're talking about, these new policies that will cause oil demand to fall. If you can get insurance companies to insure companies for enterprise risk management and offset that risk by buying this derivative, because it's the one way we found that they can actually offset this risk in the market, you A, issue more insurance, B, you get long-term price signals, and the last thing you get out of this is you see a much more rapid repricing of assets, right? And in fact, my goal in building this thing is that eventually the derivative price would go to zero because we were on a 2 degree C world and there was no difference between the business as usual and 2 degree C. So there are, there are a lot of other instruments that work on individual country basis. They're always trying to overcome specific idiosyncrasies around that market. A lot of what finance does is try to find workaround solutions to risks that policies that looked really intelligent 30 years ago haven't changed and now look sort of silly. So you have financial systems to work around it. So the first thing you want to do is you want to get rid of those sillinesses, but then on top of that, you want to actually manage risk on a global basis to try to overcome the problem.
Yeah, and this also coincides with some of the work that we're doing with some companies on applying the task force recommendations on financial disclosures, which is actually that now more and more las compañías van a tener que reportar en sus estados financieros.
They will have to show in their financial reports the risk of the impact of climate change and also of energy transition. And well, there's a huge trend that shows that the market signals will also change there. And that's where the roots of my project lie. So now to conclude, César, one more question for you. Is there any kind of coordination of policies on energy and climate between Latin American countries? Yes, of course. Mexico, in many cases, has a more North American logic in place. So a lot of the coordination of policies is carried out with Canada and the States, rather, and also maybe, why not, with other countries of Latin America. But my experience during the 4 or 5 years in this project was that there were 6-7 meetings of ministers of energy of North America, and very seldom regarding energy. I'm talking now about the Mexican case. We had very seldom meetings with ministers or other officials from Latin American countries. Now, regarding efficiency, yes, we cooperate a lot with Latin America, and our agency, CONUBE, carried out seminars and training in different countries and attended fora, etc. Just to mention some cases of North America where we took part. Well, Mexico, together with Canada, were part of the Mission Innovation, which was a commitment to multiply resources allocated to research and development in order to research things such as carbon capture and storage. And a study was carried out in North America about the reliability of electrical systems where more renewables were integrated. This study was carried out by Enron. Originally, this laboratory based in Colorado, and it was carried out initially for the US, but then it was extended also to Canada and to Mexico. And it was also carried out at the North American level. So a database was created, a common database, which was provided by the Energy Department of the US with information on the prices of electrical markets of these 3 countries where all the central electrical plants were taken into account. And so there we really have worked a lot, but focus more on North America and some other cases also with Latin American countries. After all, we do have cultural affinities with them. And of course, we are neighbors of other Central American countries. But as I said, we have more affinities with North America. Well, I think that we have to conclude right now because we are out of time right now. And I would like to look at the results. So this has reduced. We were at 90%, now we are at 77%. But, well, it seems that we are quite self-complacent, right? We seem to think that we are doing a good job. Well, now to action. We have to go back to action, as Arias Cañete said. And I would like to thank you for coming today. Thank you for listening to our speakers, and see you soon.